High-functioning depression doesn't look the way most people imagine depression looks. It doesn't look like staying in bed for days, or crying publicly, or obviously struggling to manage basic tasks. It looks like going to work, mostly on time. It looks like answering emails. It looks like showing up to social events and being reasonably present, maybe even funny, at least for the duration. It looks, from the outside, like someone who is fine. From the inside, it looks quite different. From the inside, there is a persistent flatness, not dramatic despair, but a kind of muted quality to everything, as if the color has been turned down across the board without a clear moment when that happened. There is a tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep, a low-grade sense of effort attached to things that used to come easily, a faint but constant awareness that enjoyment is happening less, that connection feels more effortful, that meaning is somehow thinner than it used to be. The key distinction between ordinary low periods and high-functioning depression is duration and persistence. Everyone has weeks that feel grey, periods when energy is low and motivation is absent. High-functioning depression is that quality sustained over months or years, at a level just below the threshold where most people would notice something is seriously wrong, including, often, the person themselves. One of the most disorienting aspects of high-functioning depression is that the very ability to continue functioning can make it hard to take seriously. I must be fine. I'm still going to work. I must not really be depressed. I'm still able to do most things. This reasoning delays recognition, delays help-seeking, and allows the condition to persist far longer than it needs to. At its clinical end, high-functioning depression corresponds most closely to what the diagnostic system calls persistent depressive disorder, PDD, formerly known as dysthymia. PDD is characterized by a chronically depressed mood, present on more days than not for at least 2 years, 1 year in children and adolescents, alongside at least 2 of poor appetite or overeating, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy or fatigue, low self-esteem, poor concentration or difficulty making decisions, and feelings of hopelessness. The persistent qualifier is important. PDD doesn't reach the dramatic intensity of a major depressive episode. It is lower grade, but its chronicity makes it cumulative in a way that can be just as, or more, debilitating than shorter, more acute episodes. The anhedonia, loss of pleasure, the fatigue, the low self-esteem, sustained over years, quietly reshape how a person relates to themselves, to their work, to their relationships, and to their sense of what's possible. A particularly important feature of PDD is that it so often goes undiagnosed. Because the person is functioning, maintaining the structure of their life, neither they nor those around them register it as depression. It gets attributed instead to personality. I've always been a bit of a pessimist. To circumstance. I'd be happier if my job were better. Or simply to character. I'm just a low-key person. The years pass. The condition continues. The person has never, in their memory, felt consistently well, and so they don't register that they could. There is also a complex relationship between PDD and major depressive disorder. Many people with PDD experience what's called double depression, discrete major depressive episodes superimposed on the chronic background of persistent low mood. These acute episodes are recognized and treated. The underlying chronic state is often not, which is why people with double depression frequently report returning to a baseline that still doesn't feel well after a depressive episode resolves. There is something peculiarly painful about being someone who keeps functioning through depression, not because functioning is the wrong choice, but because it can prevent the recognition and help that is needed, and because it carries its own specific costs that are invisible to almost everyone around you. The first cost is the energy expenditure. Maintaining functional output while depressed requires significantly more effort than it does when well. The cognitive resources, emotional regulation, and sheer willpower required to perform normally while the brain's regulatory systems are dysregulated is enormous and invisible. To the outside world, you are producing the same output. To the inside world, this output is costing 2 or 3 times what it should. The reserve that gets used on maintaining the surface is unavailable for anything else. For genuine connection, for pleasure, for rest, for recovery. The second cost is the masking. Over time, people with high-functioning depression often become skilled at presenting a normal face, at calibrating the performance of okayness to what the situation requires. This skill is useful for navigating the world, but it makes it increasingly hard to access help, because help requires acknowledging, at least to one person, that the performance doesn't reflect the reality. For people who have been maintaining the performance for years, this disclosure can feel enormous, almost impossible. The third cost is identity erosion. When the baseline is chronically low and has been for long enough, it can be hard to distinguish between the depression and who you actually are. Preferences, enthusiasms, ways of engaging, all are muted by the condition, and gradually the muted version begins to feel like simply your personality. People with long-standing high-functioning depression often report, after successful treatment, a sense of meeting themselves for the first time in years, discovering that they have a personality, interests, and a capacity for spontaneous enjoyment that the depression had quietly buried. One of the most consistent patterns in high-functioning depression is what might be called the threshold problem. The persistent sense that what you're experiencing isn't bad enough to merit help, that the bar for proper depression is somewhere above wherever you currently are, and that until you reach that bar, seeking support would be inappropriate or dramatic. This threshold keeps moving. When symptoms are mild, the threshold is a full depressive episode. When a full episode arrives, the threshold becomes the inability to function. When functioning is compromised, the threshold becomes not being able to get out of bed. The bar is always slightly higher than wherever the person is, which is one of the mechanisms by which depression prolongs itself. This isn't the person's fault. Several cultural forces maintain this threshold. Narratives around mental health, including well-intentioned ones, often focus on the most acute presentations, which inadvertently communicates that those are the only presentations that are serious. The language of real depression suggests there is a hierarchy, and that anything below the most severe end is not quite the genuine article. And the social expectation that people who are functioning cannot, by definition, be truly struggling means that high-functioning depression is consistently validated as not quite serious enough, right up until it reaches a crisis point. The research is clear on this. Earlier intervention in depression produces substantially better outcomes than waiting. Not because the condition is harder to treat once it's severe, it often responds to treatment regardless, but because duration matters. The longer a depressive episode runs, the more entrenched certain neurological patterns become, the more the person's relationship with themselves and their life has been shaped by the depressive lens, and the more recovery has to undo. High-functioning depression, precisely because it persists without reaching crisis level, is at particular risk of running for years without treatment, with all the cumulative costs that entails. High-functioning depression presents some specific challenges in treatment that are worth understanding, both for the person experiencing it and for those supporting them. The first is recognition. Before treatment can begin, the person typically needs to recognize that what they're experiencing is depression, which, as discussed, is often delayed by the functional surface and the moving threshold. GPs and other first contact clinicians may also miss it, particularly if the person presents with physical symptoms or if the consultation is brief and the person has become skilled at presenting as more okay than they feel. The second challenge is motivation for treatment. Depression suppresses motivation, and this includes motivation to seek and sustain treatment. Attending therapy appointments, completing between-session homework, maintaining medication adherence, or making the lifestyle changes that support recovery all require a degree of initiation and follow-through that depression specifically impairs. This is not a character flaw, it's the condition interfering with its own treatment, and it's why support structures around the treatment process, accountability, reminders, low barrier access matter. The third challenge is the gradualness of recovery. For people who have had high-functioning depression for years, recovery is also gradual, and the improvements can be subtle enough in the early stages that they're hard to notice or trust. There is often a period in treatment where something is shifting. Sleep is marginally better. There are occasional moments of genuine pleasure. The rumination is slightly quieter, but it doesn't yet feel like progress because the overall picture still feels heavy. This is the period that most often leads people to conclude that treatment isn't working, when in fact they're in the early stages of a real improvement. Cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be well suited to high-functioning depression, precisely because it works with the cognitive patterns, the self-critical thoughts, the catastrophic predictions, the minimization of positive experience that maintain the condition, and because it produces skills that can be applied ongoing rather than requiring continuous access to a therapist. Recovery from high-functioning depression doesn't always look the way people expect. It's rarely a dramatic shift, a moment where the weight lifts and everything becomes clear. It tends to be gradual, non-linear, and sometimes hard to notice precisely because you were already functioning. What it usually looks like is this. Things that used to require effort start requiring slightly less effort. The morning weight is still there, but it lifts a little earlier in the day. There are occasional moments, brief, fragile, easily dismissed, where something feels genuinely okay rather than merely manageable. A conversation that doesn't feel entirely performed, a moment of laughter that wasn't manufactured, a morning that didn't start with dread. Over time, those moments become more frequent, stay longer, and feel less precarious. The flatness gives way, in patches, to something warmer, not dramatic emotion, but a texture that wasn't there before. Preferences start to emerge more clearly. Things become interesting again, in ways that feel faintly surprising. The future, which in depression felt foreclosed, starts to feel like it has some degree of openness. One of the most common experiences reported by people recovering from long-standing, high-functioning depression is a kind of retrospective shock at how long they lived without this. Without the texture, the color, the sense of genuine engagement with their own life. Not self-pity, and not regret exactly, but a clear-eyed recognition of what had been quietly absent for so long. The other thing people often report is a changed relationship with asking for help. Having finally sought support and found that it worked, there is less resistance to seeking help in future, less internal threshold to clear. And that shift, perhaps as much as the symptom improvement itself, is one of the most enduring benefits of addressing high-functioning depression. Not just feeling better, but knowing that feeling better is possible and that you're allowed to want it.